Hello everybody, welcome to Comm1017 Intro to Communication Studies. This is your week 4 lecture, and this week we're going to be dealing with spoken language. Now, spoken language is a powerful communication tool. It gives us the ability to conceptualize our world. I can have a unique, completely unique to me idea in my head that has never been expressed anywhere to anybody. And through the vehicle of language, I can communicate that to you, and you can receive that and interpret it and have the same thought process or the same idea or the same image, whatever it is that I am using language to describe, in your head as well. It is a powerful tool. The language defined in your book is a rule-governed symbol system that allows users to generate meanings and define reality. A couple elements there that are important. Rule-governed symbol system, and it allows us to generate meanings and define reality. Spoken languages are called natural languages, and this is what we're mainly going to focus on today. And these natural languages have 4 primary characteristics. First of all, language is symbolic. We use symbols to communicate ideas that originate in our mind. For example, we use a particular sound sequence to represent the word dog. That symbol is arbitrary and it is conventional. It's arbitrary because there's no natural connection between the idea of dog and the signifier dog. There's nothing particularly dog-like about the word dog. Now, there's some words that, the word may sound like or may be related to what it represents. Bang. That's very obvious you're representing a sound. But when I say dog, there's nothing about dog that naturally makes the mind think of a dog. It's nothing dog-like about it. It's just an arbitrary word. It means dog. It is a conventional symbol because its meaning depends on social agreement. You and I have to agree that dog means dog. So English speakers have agreed to use the word dog in a certain way. And speakers of other languages would not recognize possibly what the word dog means. If they heard the word dog, it doesn't automatically register in their mind that this is that 4-legged creature that growls and barks. There is absolutely no connection to the animal. It is a conventional symbol because it depends upon our social agreement about its definition. In our language, the sound sequence dog has an arbitrary conventional meaning. It refers to that 4-legged critter that growls and barks. Now, not only is language symbolic, language is a kind of knowledge. Language is mental rather than physical. It's a body of knowledge that's stored within our brains. And what happens up here expresses itself in a physical way. Speech is the outward physical side of language. But language is the internal or mental side of speech. Language begins in your brain. It begins in your thought process. It begins in your cognitive ability. It is transmitted through the physical vehicle of speech, the auditory sound of speech. It is received through that auditory sound of speech, but then it is decoded again in the brain. It's a kind of knowledge. When we're born, we've not yet acquired the knowledge that we call language, but we have the potential to develop it. And as we grow, we learn language as infants and as children by listening to those around us talk and figuring out for ourselves, and sometimes with a little instruction through classroom, but we figure out the rules that make up the language. All infants have the potential to learn sounds and words and sentence structures for any language. This is why kids that are born into bilingual homes are just as natural, can be just as natural in both languages as they are in one or the other. There is that tendency exists to learn language in every human baby, every human being that is born. We all have that potential, and it's not just limited to the language of our culture. You can be an English-speaking family. Let me try this again. You could be a Chinese-speaking family and give up an infant for adoption. The infant could end up in an English-speaking home and grow up in an English-speaking home, completely grasp and comprehend the rules for speaking English, and never learn any Chinese at all, and have absolutely no grasp of the Chinese language. The type of language is not predisposed by our genetics. The type of language is not predisposed by what we are, our physical makeup, our physical genetical makeup. The type of language is predisposed by what we hear. It's by what we're around. We learn. It's a knowledge base. It's something that we acquire. All right, so apparently the recording shut down in the middle of that first section where I was telling you that language is a knowledge base. It's something that we acquire through hearing, through education. It's something that we learn and implant in our thinking, our mental processes. It is knowledge based. The third characteristic of language is that it is rule governed and productive. We can generate and understand sentences that we've never heard before. Just because we've never heard a particular sequence of words doesn't mean we can't understand that particular sequence of words. It's a matter of knowing rules, not memorizing sequences. Of course, most of us can't consciously explain the rules that we follow as we speak and listen, but we can use them to make ourselves understood. These rules are complex and they're interrelated. They tell us how to make the sounds of our language and how to combine those sounds into words and how to order those words into sentences and how to use sentences in interaction. So language is rule governed. We learn the rules and we practice the rules, and so we're not even aware that we know the rules, and it is productive. It lets us accomplish something. Fourth, language has powerful effects on how we experience and respond to the world. We store much of our knowledge of the world in categories provided for us by our language. We define and describe and categorize things by words that have meaning to us. There's a hypothesis in your book, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it consists of two different corollaries. First of all, one is linguistic determinism, and the other is linguistic relativity. Linguistic determinism is the theory that language determines thought. Sapir believed that we are at the mercy of our language. The human language and the habits of our community to use that language predispose certain choices of interpretation for us. Our understanding of the language shapes how we interpret our world. That's a neat concept, and what follows on it is linguistic relativity, which follows from linguistic determinism. It hypothesizes that people from different language communities perceive the world differently because of their language. Now let me give you a little example. This actually appears in your textbook, and it'll help you maybe understand. For French-speaking people have two different pronouns for two different words for the personal pronoun you. One is more formal and one is less formal. Whereas in English-speaking countries, we may not be very conscious of formal and informal. When we say you, we're not making a discernment about whether our relationship with you is formal or informal, whether or not we don't gauge that relationship at all. But in French countries, just to say the word you, there has to be a decision made about relationship, and has to be translated into that pronoun. So they are more relational in the way that they view the world. They're more relational in the way that they define each other, and they have hierarchies that develop of thought process. All of that springs from the language. Now, maybe it's not the best example in the world, but surely it can help you see how that our language helps us. It shapes how we perceive our world. There's some things we don't have language to describe. There's some things that we don't have language to help us come to some conclusions that other people of other nationalities with different languages may come to on their own because of their language. The fifth characteristic of language is that it is fluid. It changes over time. The grammar changes, the rules for social usage can change, pronunciations can shift, old words, not worlds, old words are done away with, and new words are created. Grammar, pronunciation, all of those things change slowly, but they change. Now, words are something that changes quickly. Words enter our vocabulary very fast. Every year there's words that when we begin the year were not a part of the lexicon of human language or English language, and then at the end of the year we're celebrating these new words that have been introduced this year. But at the same time that words are added in a rather quick fashion, words also fall out of usage in a rather quick fashion. So those things can change really fast. But grammar rules and pronunciation rules, those things change much, much slower. All right, now it's time for one of those words that you probably haven't heard before, neologism. A neologism refers to a new word that is in the process of entering the language but has not yet been widely accepted. They enhance communication because they allow us to express new realities for which there must be a new word because there is not an existing word to describe that reality. A good example of that is the word Google. It began life as a company name. It began life as a search engine. But Google is now been assimilated into the language. It has been assimilated into the language as a verb. And we speak of Googling something as a verb, as a word, as a term that has meaning. There was a point where Google was a brand new concept, and it was not widely accepted yet, but it was already in usage. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about a neologism. The addition of new words is not the only way language changes. Sometimes old words take on new meanings, and sometimes connotations shift as a result of a conscious attempt by groups to reappropriate meanings, perhaps by changing the meaning of a negative term to a positive term by embracing and appropriating the term. Early Oneness Pentecostals were called Jesus only, and it was intended to be a derogatory title. It implied that we were denying the other roles of God and that we were just focused on Jesus only. However, our elders eventually embraced the term and even doubled down on it. They said, don't call us Jesus only, call us Jesus everything, because that's what we are. So they reappropriated that negative term, what was intended to have been a negative term, and turned it into a group positive, something that defines us, something that tells who we are. We're not just Jesus only, we're Jesus everything. We believe that Jesus is the Father. We believe that Jesus is the Son. We believe that Jesus is the Holy Ghost. We believe that the mighty God, the Ancient of Days, was manifest in flesh, died for our sins on a cross, and that it's His Spirit that fills us when we receive the baptism of the Holy Ghost. We're Jesus everything. All right, language has a complex structure. It's a complicated thing. And the best way to understand the structure of language is to look at it through the study of 4 subsystems of language. So we're going to look at those 4 subsystems. The first is the sounds of language. When you first experience a foreign language, all that you hear is a string of sounds that don't make any sense to you. Over time, if you invest yourself in learning that language, you can learn how to pronounce those sounds correctly and how to combine them with one another and how to create the words that are part of that language. When you've accomplished that, when you learn to put the sounds together and make the sounds into words, you will have mastered the first subsystem of language, the sound system. The study of significant sound patterns of language is called phonology. And phonology is something that looks at the series of rules that govern permissible sounds and sound combinations. The significant sound distinctions in a given language are called its phonemes. In English, ba, or the. Those are phonemes. They're parts of a word. They're they're sounds that make up a word. They're used to construct words. But because we know the difference between "buh" and "th," no English speaker will confuse the words "bat" and "dat," because we know the difference between "buh" and "th." And they are the basic building blocks of language. They are the sounds of language. They're what language is built on. The second subsystem is the words of language. In every spoken language, sounds are combined into meaningful sequences that are commonly called words. The study of those units of meaning is called semantics. And on the semantical level, language consists of a series of rules regulating the relationship between sound sequences and some meaning. Although most of us use the term word to refer to units of meaning in language, the correct term is morpheme. And some morphemes are called free morphemes, and they are basically words. Words like boy, girl, those are free morphemes. But there are other morphemes that represent something less than complete words. They're called bound morphemes, and they have to be attached to a free morpheme in order for them to make sense. They're basically what we call prefixes and suffixes. So the bound morpheme ish. Ish means having the quality of. That is never found alone, but is always combined with a free morpheme. Boyish means they have the quality of being a boy. And so you can see how that those two, a bound morpheme and a free morpheme, interact together. Now, multiple bound morphemes can be combined with a free morpheme to create a new word. For example, the word anti-disestablishmentarianism is one word. Let me try that again. Anti-disestablishmentarianism is one word made up of 6 bound morphemes attached to one free morpheme. The free morpheme is established. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. It's all one word composed of 6 bound morphemes linked to one single free morpheme. Go try that word out on your friends. Anti-disestablishmentarianism. Matter of fact, if you can spit that out, you're doing pretty good. Now, just understanding morphemes and how they relate to one another is not enough. If a non-English speaker memorized an English dictionary, he or she would still not have total command of the English language, because a dictionary, while it defines words, does not explain how to construct sentences. So we've gone from sounds and how to make the sounds, and now we combine those sounds into morphemes, and we know that there are free morphemes and there are bound morphemes, and we understand now that sounds work together to give meaning to words, and we're at the lexicon level of the language, but that doesn't help us with understanding the language, because words have to be constructed into sentences, and sentences have their own set of rules. That brings us to the third subsystem of language, the sentences of language. So in order to speak English, you have to know the grammatical rules that govern English sentence construction. The study of that sentence structure is called syntactics. And on the syntactic level, language consists of a series of rules regulating how we sequence morphemes to create grammatical utterances. It matters what order you put the words in. Word order gives meaning to a sentence. So attempts to describe the syntactic knowledge necessary for even the simplest conversation are extraordinarily complex. It's a very in-depth system. It's a very complicated system. Luckily, we don't have to identify those complicated grammatical theories to be able to use the language. We use syntactic knowledge automatically and unconsciously to generate new sentences and to recognize the new sentences that we hear that perhaps we'd never heard before. We have meanings for morphemes, and we have rules that govern how they're used in a sentence, and all of a sudden we begin to understand a language that is happening at the sentence structure, sentence subsystem of the language. Man, I'm having a rough time talking this morning. It's early in the morning, it's storming outside. I haven't had my cup of coffee. That is the problem. Just bear with me, we'll get through this lecture together. That brings us to the fourth and final subsystem of language, and that is social context. Knowing how to form grammatical sentences is necessary for good communication, but that alone is not enough. To be really effective, speakers have to say the right thing at the right time in the right way. So that's the fourth subsystem of language. It's the study of how we use language in social context, and it is known as pragmatics. On the pragmatic level, language consists of a series of rules that specify the relationships between words, sentences, and the social intent or speech act of the communicator. So let's talk through some of those, what those things are. First of all, let's talk about what a speech act is. We talk to accomplish goals. When we speak, we're trying to do something. We're trying to accomplish something. And pragmatic knowledge allows us to understand the intentions of others and to make our own intentions clear. The goal of a speaker, the thing that he or she intends to accomplish through the speech, is called the speech act. Successful communication involves understanding the relationship between words and sentences and speech acts, the speech acts that the words and sentences represent. To do that, we have to go beyond grammatical knowledge and draw on social knowledge, because words and sentences take on different meanings in different contexts. So the second element here is context. Context offers us the social information we need in order to understand a speech act. Your book introduces something called the Coordinated Management of Meaning Theory, the CMM theory, and that theory provides a framework for understanding how individuals use context to assign pragmatic meaning to the things that they're hearing, the language that they are receiving. CMM accounts for 4 levels of context, and we're going to cover all 4 here real briefly. First of all, there is an episode. An episode simply means the situation we find ourselves in during a given interaction. Then there is relationship. Relationship refers to the role obligations that we feel toward one another. Then there is life script. Life script is our professional or personal identity. Who we are helps define what we're saying and what it means. And then finally, there is cultural pattern. And cultural pattern consists of the cultural norms that we share with others. Understanding those factors helps us interpret the messages that we receive correctly and to communicate messages to others correctly. Let me give you an example. If your professional identity is that of an aggressive defense attorney, that's a life script. I'm an aggressive defense attorney. When I step in the courtroom, certain things are expected out of me. There's a script that I follow. I am an aggressive defense attorney. And I'm engaged in a cross-examination. That's an episode. The cross-examination is the particular episode that I'm engaged in. The person that I am cross-examining is a hostile witness. Now that's another element. That's a relationship. So I'm an aggressive defense attorney. I'm in a cross-examination with a hostile witness. And then that is being conducted in a U.S. court of law. That's the cultural pattern. You understand there's certain kinds of speech and certain speech patterns and certain rules that govern the proceedings in a court of law. So all of those 4 elements, my life script as a defense attorney, the episode is cross-examination that has its own script. the relationship, it's a hostile witness, which means that we're not being friendly here, and I am probably accusing them of doing some wrong, and it's taking place in a court of law, which has its own set of governing principles. Those contexts define the way that I have to communicate. What I say, what I do in that context is governed by those things. But the same speaker can leave the courtroom and go to dinner with his or her spouse, and all of a sudden, different context changes the way we communicate. A spouse can't be treated like a witness, at least not if a marriage is going to survive. What's admirable in a courtroom isn't necessarily admirable at the kitchen table. Tell this to every general whose family has ever rose up against the idea that he runs his house like he runs his unit in the military. You can't. Those are different contexts, and they require a different kind of communication. Pragmatic knowledge is essential to help you navigate those various contexts. A good communicator understands that different situations demand different styles of communication. As we move from one style to another, the structure and function of the language changes. Back when we were talking about syntax, the basic unit of syntax is a sentence. And so the basic unit of pragmatics is a discourse. A discourse is a unit of language larger than a single sentence. It consists of all connected sentences that form an identifiable structure to fill a communicative function. The most common mode of spoken communication is conversation. And through conversations, we generate and create and maintain relationships. We explore and develop personal identities, and we accomplish daily tasks. This is the most private and most personal mode of communication. It differs from other forms of discourse because of this. It calls for language that is reciprocal. It calls for language that is personal, that's informal, that's spontaneous, and private. And that privacy is an important thing. Sometimes to breach the confidence of that conversation is considered to be an absolute betrayal of the person you were talking with. The meanings in conversation are often implicit, they're implied. You don't have to say explicitly what you mean. You can kind of imply something, and your conversation partner picks up on that and interprets that and understands that, because the function of that kind of communication is relationship oriented. It is relational. And so it's built upon that relationship we have one with another. There's inside information that only we have, and so whenever we share something, we can share a thought or an idea with just a part of a word, or even with just a particular kind of a look. There are ways we communicate with each other in that conversational level that are very informal and that are very implicit, that we imply things. Whereas if you move to a different kind of discourse, say classroom interaction, which we don't have in this class, I wish we did. Classroom interaction is more scripted. It's non-reciprocal. You don't just interrupt the teacher, particularly in this medium. You can't interrupt the teacher, because if you start talking, I'm just going to keep on talking because I have no idea that you are interrupting me. It is formal and it is publicly accessible. It stresses explicit meanings. I kind of try to spell out everything I mean in this kind of a lecture situation. And it's task-oriented. I'm trying to accomplish certain goals, and my communication is aimed at accomplishing those goals. When we sit in a classroom together, there's a little bit more of an informal air that gets in there, and the teacher starts the classroom lecture knowing that I've got these particular points I need to hit. But there's usually some discussion that may get generated at different points in that lecture, kind of take us in a different turn here and there and add some life to the lecture. But when you're doing a lecture like I'm doing a lecture, where I'm sitting in front of a computer and I'm recording a lecture that nobody else is here to listen to me and to interact with me, it makes it a whole lot more obvious that this is a task-oriented thing. I'm clicking right through my points. I know what I want to say, and I know how I want to say it, and there's not a lot of asides that take place, and so it's very structured, very task-oriented. That's what makes a a recorded lecture less interesting than an in-person lecture, because if we were in person, there would be a little bit more give and take between us. But this is a very task-oriented, very explicit kind of communication. Now here's the thing. The syntax and vocabulary used in conversation is different than the syntax and vocabulary used in the classroom. That's the difference between context, and that's how context impacts different forms of communication. No matter what the context, during interaction, communicators have to coordinate their contributions and be sensitive to coherence and structure. Conversation or even classroom interaction is about interaction. It's about give and take. And so there are some rules that govern conversation or even classroom discourse or any kind of communication that is reciprocal. It's give and take. There's a little here and a little there. It's called the cooperative principle, and it asserts that for talk to work, communicators have to be willing to cooperate with one another by following 4 conventional rules. First, you have to make sure that your contributions contain enough but not too much information. This is called the quantity maxim. You ever talk with someone, perhaps there's someone among your group of friends that whenever they start telling something, they don't have any idea of how to summarize things. And so you've got to get the whole story. You've got to go all the way back to Adam and Eve and come up through the flood now to get to what they're trying to tell you right here and right now. That is when that happens, they're not respecting the quantity maxim. Part of language, part of communication, part of these episodes of conversation is that we want to limit the information that we give to specifically what is needed in the moment. Secondly, speakers must be truthful. If you say something absurd, you violate what's called the quality maxim. So there's a quantity maxim, which governs the amount of information, and a quality maxim, which governs the quality of information. Third, speakers must also be sure that their contributions are direct and pertinent. Otherwise, you fail to follow the relevancy maxim. If we're talking about one thing, and one member of the conversation all of a sudden, just off the cuff, begins to talk about something else, it doesn't relate at all. They're breaking this rule, the relevancy maxim. And then finally, speakers should follow the manners maxim. They should be direct, they should be clear, and they should recognize that this is a turn-based thing. It's not just about one person talking, but a conversation is about 2 people or more people talking. When communicators don't follow those rules, conversations break down. Nobody wants to carry on a conversation with someone who has no regard for truth, or who changes the topic at a moment's notice, or whose contributions make no sense, or whose concept of an appropriate amount of talk is all skewed, and they just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and never really get to what they're trying to say. Speakers also have to concern themselves with sequence. In order for conversations to work, every move must follow the previous move and fit into an overall conversation. That means that communicators have to keep track of what is going on in the talk, and they have to build off of one another's contributions to the conversation without losing sight of their own conversational goals. And we struggle with this sometimes. This way back in that chapter we did last week about listening. We start formulating our response and we stop listening to what is said, and then all of a sudden we're saying something that is incongruent with what has just been said in the conversation. So we have to juggle all those things. We have to be aware of what's been said. We have to be aware of what we want to accomplish and what we are responding to, and the things need to match up. We also have to know when it's time to make a conversational move. In conversations, it's important that you know whose turn it is to speak. There are certain signals, certain things that imply, this is a good point to break in. This is a good time for me to speak. This is my turn to speak. This is your turn to speak. This is his turn to speak. This is her turn to speak. We don't pass a speaking stick around. My family is very vocal. Me and my wife and my two boys, and when we get to debating something, we get to talking over each other, and I'm not beyond getting something saying, okay, this is the speaking stick. When you have it, it's your turn to speak. If you don't have it, you hold your peace. When you finish what you're saying, you give the stick to somebody else. And this is the way we make sure everybody gets to talk, because we don't always follow this rule real well. We don't always recognize that this is a turn-based thing, and I have to give somebody else a chance to speak as well. Finally, conversational partners have to be able to head off problems before they occur, or if they aren't able to head them off before they occur, then they have to be able to repair misunderstandings. Sometimes what you're saying gets misinterpreted. If you can recognize that as it's happening, you can correct it while you're speaking. Sometimes what you said got misinterpreted, and it takes the conversation in a whole other direction that you didn't intend for it to go, and you have to stop and back up and try to repair the damage that's been done because of the miscommunication that has taken place. That's all a part of the convention of conversation. Now, every part of an interaction has its own structure and function. For example, conversational closings signal the end of an interaction. They establish closure. They reassure partners about the interaction, and they establish the nature of future interactions. When we finish talking with someone, especially if it's someone we may not see again for a week or two, we tend to end that conversation in some kind of a structure that says, hey, I've really enjoyed this. This has been helpful to me. This has been beneficial. Let's not wait too long before we get together again. Maybe we need to meet over lunch sometime. Those are all part of the formal discourse of a closing or ending of a conversation. Now, in order to become more aware of the way a specific form of discourse works, you analyze it through 4 sets of questions. First of all, what is the purpose of the discourse? Now, what you're asking is, what do I hope to achieve? What does my partner hope to achieve? Do we agree on what we're hoping to achieve? This could be a major issue. That maybe I've got one set of goals and my partner has another set of goals, and we're never going to be able to agree. So because we don't have the purpose figured out, we're never going to be successful in this discourse. And so then you ask yourself, what would make this discourse successful for me? And what would make it a failure for me? What would make this discourse successful for my partner? And what would make it a failure for them? If we can get purpose lined out, we're on our way to understanding how this discourse should work. The second thing is, what rules regulate the discourse? What speech acts are expected of me? And what speech acts should I avoid? There are certain formal settings that there are certain things I shouldn't do, certain things I shouldn't say, certain speech acts that I should not try to accomplish. The third, what are the normal style and structures of this discourse? What specialized language may be called for? What is expected of me? How do I begin the interaction? How do I end the interaction? How might meanings here be different than they are elsewhere? Are there any specific word meanings here that are specific to the context of this conversation? And then fourth, what are the effects of engaging in this form of discourse? What values and assumptions are presupposed here? Do I agree with those values? Do they govern the way I'm speaking? Do they have an impact on the conversation? Those 4 questions help you understand how you should communicate in any specific context. All right, so let's wrap up with this. Language is a powerful thing. And one of the themes of this chapter is that language empowers us. Our linguistic choices count. They make a difference in our lives and in the lives of others. If we use language wisely, we control communication. If we do not, then communication can have unintended effects. We decide then, and your book has a whole section on this, and I'm just going to touch on it, but we have to decide whether our communication should be ambiguous or clear and direct. And there are contexts that call for both. ambiguity, and directness. We have to decide whether it's immediate or non-immediate. And once again, there are contexts that call for both kinds. Abstract or concrete. And again, that's determined by context. Should we be straightforward, explicit, or are we going to be metaphorical? That all is determined by context. And understanding those contexts and understanding how to use them can make you a powerful communicator. Language is a powerful tool. It allows us to exchange meanings. It allows us to make contact with and influence and persuade one another, and it is absolutely essential to human interaction. Yet despite the great power that it gives us, language also exerts power over us. Our thoughts and perceptions are filtered through the language that we understand, and they can be distorted by our language. It's important then that we use language with care and sensitivity, that we realize that it can lead us astray, and often it does lead us astray. I counsel a lot as a pastor with people who are having marital issues, and almost every time that there is one of those impassable, inconsolable arguments that you just can't get past, there lies at the heart of that a miscommunication. One person believes one thing and another person believes another thing, and both things are different from the thing that was said or done. And so getting to the heart of that and understanding how we interpret things and how we understand language will help us in every aspect of our life. We have to use language carefully. We have to invest ourselves in being able to understand the language, and we have to invest ourselves in making sure we get it right, particularly in context. There are some things that we need to understand. We've seen that words are social agreements, and they're agreements to express ideas in a particular way. But we have to remember that the meanings for words exist in people, not in dictionaries, not in lexicons, and not in the words themselves. You have to make sure that the word that you're using, that you share a common meaning with the person that you're speaking to. This is the basic fundamental way that miscommunication occurs. Even though we share a common language, all of us shade the meaning of words and phrases with our own experiences. And what is a trigger for one person may not mean anything to another person. So we have to work at getting that stuff worked out. Make sure that we're on the same page about what words mean. And the problem with human interaction is we often mean more than we say and say less than we mean. And so this idea of communicating is tricky business. If we're going to understand it, we have to be able to make inferences about the communicative intents of others. There are rules. You don't understand them. I don't understand them. You can't cite them. I can't cite them. But we use certain rules to discern the intention of our communication partner and to govern the conversation. That is defined by purpose. It's defined by audience. And it's defined by the communicative conventions that we've talked about today. When we finally get all of that figured out, we might become good communicators. And that's the end goal. Go communicate with somebody and think about how communication works. When you're in your conversations today, think about how context defines how you communicate, how the meanings of words are impacted, how there's certain agreements between you and your best friend that are not in place with you and your professor, and how there's a difference in the way you communicate. This week, I want you to think about language, how powerful it is, and how tricky it can be to understand. God bless you. I hope you have a great week.